Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the disappearance of Andrew Gosden. It began on a morning that felt entirely unremarkable, a Friday, the 14th of September, 2007. In the suburb of Balby, nestled within the town of Doncaster, the dawn broke with a gentle, cool touch. The air carried that distinct, sharp scent of early autumn, a mix of damp earth and the faint, sweet decay of falling leaves. The sky was a pale, muted gray, the kind of light that softens the edges of the world, making the red brick houses and the quiet streets feel still and timeless. For most people in South Yorkshire that day, it was simply the end of another week, a steady march toward the weekend. But for the Gosden family, this morning would become the silent threshold between a life they knew and a mystery that would never truly end. Breathe in the cool morning air of 2007. Feel the stillness of a town just beginning to stir. Everything is calm. Everything is in its place. Inside the home on Littlemore Lane, the domestic rhythm was familiar and soft. Andrew Gosden, a 14-year-old boy with a mind as sharp as a diamond, was slow to wake. This was unusual for him. Typically, he was an early riser, someone who met the day with quiet efficiency. But on this specific Friday, his mother, Glennies, noticed a slight irritability in him, a lingering sleepiness that made him reach for the day with a bit of a struggle. Imagine the sound of a house waking up. The low hum of the refrigerator, the distant clink of a ceramic mug against a counter, and the soft, rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. Andrew sat at the breakfast table, his glasses catching the morning light. He was a gifted student, a lover of mathematics and science, a boy who found solace in the complex patterns of the world. To his parents, he was the same thoughtful, introverted son he had always been. They saw him in his school uniform, a crisp white shirt and a striped tie. The familiar weight of routine settled on his shoulders. There was no sign of distress, no hidden flicker of anxiety in his brown eyes. He was simply Andrew, finishing his breakfast in the quiet warmth of his home. At 8:05 in the morning, Andrew stood by the door. His voice was steady as he called out his final words to his family, "See you later." It was a phrase he had spoken hundreds of times before, a verbal anchor to the expectation of a shared evening. He stepped out into the world, his school bag slung over his shoulder. A family friend, a local vicar, saw him walking across Westfield Park. The grass was likely still silvered with dew, the blades bending softly under his footsteps. To anyone watching, he was a student on his way to the bus stop, perhaps lost in thought about a difficult equation or the lyrics of a favorite song. But as he reached the boundary of the park, the routine fractured. Instead of turning toward the school bus, Andrew walked with purpose toward a local garage. There, at a cold, metallic cash machine, he inserted his card. He had £214 in his account, the patient savings of a teenager. He withdrew £200, the maximum the machine would allow in £20 increments. The sound of the machine whirring, the crisp snap of the fresh bills as they emerged. These were the first secret notes of a journey he was taking alone. Once his parents and sister had departed for their own days, the house on Littlemore Lane fell into a profound silence. Andrew returned. He let himself back in, the click of the lock echoing in the empty hallway. In the stillness of his bedroom, he began to methodically shed the identity of the schoolboy. He took off his school blazer, hanging it carefully over the back of a chair, just as he did every day. He placed the rest of his uniform into the washing machine, a small act of domestic tidiness that would later haunt his parents with its normalcy. He reached into his wardrobe for clothes that felt more like himself. He pulled on a black Slipknot t-shirt, the fabric soft from wear, and a pair of black jeans. He fastened a black wristwatch to his left wrist, the hands ticking away the minutes toward his departure. He packed a black canvas satchel, its surface adorned with patches of the rock and metal bands he loved. Inside, he placed his keys, his wallet, and his Sony PSP game console. Curiously, he left the charger behind. He left his passport in its drawer. He even left 100 pounds of birthday money sitting on his desk. He was leaving, but he was leaving light, carrying only the essentials for a journey that seemed, in his mind, to have a very specific destination. At 9:05, a neighbor's security camera captured a final glimpse of him in Doncaster. He was walking down Littlemore Lane, moving away from his home and toward the town's railway station. He walked with a calm, steady pace, his satchel slung over his right shoulder. The morning sun was beginning to burn through the gray mist, casting long, soft shadows on the pavement. When he reached the station, the atmosphere was a cacophony of travelers, the announcements booming over the speakers, the hiss of steam, and the heavy thud of suitcases. Andrew walked to the ticket counter. He spoke to a woman behind the glass, his voice likely quiet but certain. He asked for a ticket to London King's Cross. The clerk, perhaps noticing his youth, mentioned that a return ticket was only a few pence more, perhaps 50 pence or £1, but Andrew was firm. He wanted a one-way ticket. He counted out the cash, took the small slip of orange card, and tucked it away. He was a 14-year-old boy standing on a platform, waiting for the 9:35 train to carry him away from the familiar and into the sprawling, crowded heart of the capital. The train arrived with a low rumble that vibrated through the soles of his shoes. He stepped on, found a seat by the window, and as the doors slid shut, the quiet Friday morning in Doncaster began to fade into the distance. The morning air in Doncaster on that Friday was crisp, carrying the faint, metallic scent of the nearby railway lines and the dampness of the turning season. Andrew moved through this familiar world with a quiet, focused energy, his steps rhythmic on the pavement as he approached the cash machine. He stood before the glowing screen of the automated teller, a small figure in a black Slipknot t-shirt that seemed to absorb the pale morning light. The machine hummed, a mechanical vibration that he could feel through his fingertips as he pressed the buttons. He requested the sum of £200. It was nearly everything he had, the culmination of careful saving and quiet discipline. The machine whirred for a long moment, the sound of rollers and plastic gears laboring behind the metal faceplate before it began to dispense the money. One by one, the crisp, polymer notes slid through the slot, 10 20-pound notes in a neat, rhythmic succession. He took them, the paper feeling unnaturally clean and stiff against his palms. He folded the stack, tucking the weight of £200 into his wallet, leaving only £14 behind in the digital void of his account. It was a decisive act, a gathering of resources that felt heavy with intent, though his face remained as unreadable as the gray sky above. From the bank, he turned his sights toward the Doncaster railway station, a sprawling hub where the tracks converge like silver veins in the heart of South Yorkshire. The walk was familiar, yet today, the textures of the city seemed heightened. He passed the brickwork of local shops, the smell of frying oil from a nearby cafe mingling with the exhaust of the morning traffic. When he reached the station, the atmosphere shifted. The air inside the concourse was thick with the scent of diesel, old stone, and the ozone of high-voltage overhead lines. It was a place of transition, filled with the echoing announcements of departures and the frantic clicking of heels on the polished floors. Andrew walked toward the ticket office, his black canvas bag slung over his shoulder. The bag was a patchwork of his identity, covered in the logos of the bands he loved, the fabric slightly frayed at the edges from daily use. He waited in line, a 14-year-old boy lost in the sea of commuters in their sharp suits and heavy overcoats. He was a shadow among the busy, a quiet observer of a world that didn't yet know he was slipping away from it. When he reached the window, he spoke to the woman behind the glass, his voice likely a soft murmur against the roar of the station. He asked for a single ticket to London King's Cross. The clerk, a woman who would later find herself haunted by this brief interaction, looked at the young boy, and noted the strange economy of his request. She leaned toward the microphone and explained that a return ticket would cost only 50 pence more than the single he was holding in his mind. For a mere 50 pence, the price of a small sweet or a handful of change, he could have secured his passage home. It was a logical, almost negligible difference, the kind of bargain that any traveler would instinctively accept. But Andrew was firm. He did not hesitate, nor did he seem confused by the math. He insisted on the single ticket. He counted out the 31 pounds and 40 pence in cash, the notes passing through the tray at the bottom of the glass partition. The ticket that emerged was a small slip of orange card, a one-way invitation to a city 200 miles away. He tucked it into his pocket, the refusal of the return journey hanging in the air like an unspoken sentence. In that moment, the 50 pence he saved was not a triumph of thrift, but a chilling marker of a path that only led forward. He moved onto the platform, standing near the edge as the 9:35 Great Northeastern Railway service pulled into the station. The train was a massive, silver and blue beast, its brakes squealing with a high-pitched, metallic protest as it slowed to a halt. The doors hissed open, releasing a burst of warm, stale air from the carriages. Andrew stepped inside, finding a seat in a coach that smelled of coffee and damp upholstery. He sat by the window, his reflection ghostly against the glass as the train began to pull away, leaving the familiar spires and chimneys of Doncaster behind. A woman sat down next to him, and for the next hour and 45 minutes, she would be the last person to share his immediate space. She noticed him not because he was disruptive, but because he was so remarkably still. He pulled his PlayStation Portable from his bag, the small screen glowing with a sharp, artificial blue light in the dimness of the carriage. He was engrossed, his thumbs moving with practiced precision over the buttons, his eyes fixed on the digital world within the handheld console. He did not look at the rolling hills of the English countryside or the industrial skeletons of the towns they bypassed. He was a boy in a bubble of light, traveling south at 100 miles per hour, anchored only by the game in his hands and the silent weight of the money in his pocket. The journey was a blur of steel and speed, the train carving its way through the landscape until the green fields began to give way to the dense, grey sprawl of North London. As the train slowed, approaching the great Victorian terminus of King's Cross, the light outside changed, becoming filtered by the soot-stained glass of the soaring station roof. The train glided to a stop at 11:20 in the morning. Andrew gathered his things, the strap of his bag cutting a familiar line across his slipknot t-shirt. He stepped onto the platform, the air here cooler and more stagnant than the wind of the north. He walked with purpose, blending into the river of passengers moving toward the ticket barriers. The station was a labyrinth of noise, the thunder of engines, the shouting of vendors, and the frantic energy of a million lives intersecting. At 11:25, he passed the final barrier and walked toward the main exit. The security cameras captured him there, a grainy, flickering image of a boy with his head slightly tilted, his black watch visible on his wrist. He stepped out of the station and into the brilliant, overwhelming light of the London streets. He did not look back at the trains that could have taken him home. He simply walked into the crowd, a single ticket's journey complete, as the city swallowed him whole. The train slows as it enters the grand, cavernous belly of King's Cross Station. It is 11:20 in the morning on the 14th of September, 2007. The screech of iron against iron echoes through the vast, vaulted hall, a sound that is both industrial and haunting. As the doors hiss open, a wave of commuters spills out onto the platform, their footsteps a rhythmic patter against the stained concrete. Amidst this sea of suits and trench coats, a 14-year-old boy steps down. He is small for his age, almost swallowed by the magnitude of the architecture. The air here is heavy with the smell of diesel, old grease, and the faint, metallic scent of the tracks. Above, the sky is visible through the soot-stained glass of the roof, a pale, hazy blue. London is warm today, reaching 21 degrees Celsius, a dry heat that lingers in the stagnant air of the terminal. Andrew adjusts the strap of his black canvas bag, which is slung over his right shoulder. The bag is heavy, weighted down by his wallet, his keys, and the portable game console he had been playing for the last 2 hours. It is decorated with patches of his favorite bands, small splashes of color and rebellion against the dark fabric of his bag and jeans. At 11:24, high above the moving crowds, a grainy lens captures a flicker of movement. The closed-circuit television, cameras of Platform 5 flicker with the image of a boy in a black Slipknot t-shirt. The shirt features a bold, aggressive design in red and white, a sharp contrast to the quiet, studious boy wearing it. He walks with a steady, purposeful gait, his head slightly tilted. Through the low-resolution digital noise of the footage, we see his rectangular glasses catching the fluorescent glare of the station lights. He is not looking around with the wide-eyed wonder of a tourist. He moves as if he has a destination in mind, or perhaps as if he is trying very hard to blend into the shadows. He passes through the ticket barriers, his small frame momentarily eclipsed by the tall figures of businessmen and travelers. There is a strange, profound weight to these few seconds of video. It is a digital ghost, a collection of pixels that represents the very last time the world can say with absolute certainty where Andrew Gosden was. He moves toward the main exit, his face partially obscured, yet his presence is unmistakable to those who know the unique double ridge of his right ear or the specific way he carries himself. Slightly deaf in his left ear, and navigating a world of sound that must feel lopsided and muffled. The clock ticks toward 11:25 and 2 seconds. Andrew steps out of the main entrance and onto the forecourt of Euston Road. The transition from the shaded interior of the station to the bright London sunlight is sudden. In the footage, he seems to blink against the glare, his silhouette sharpening against the pale stone of the pavement. He passes a man in a white t-shirt, two strangers crossing paths in a moment that would mean nothing to one and everything to a family left behind. Beyond the station doors, the city of London waits like a vast, intricate machine. Buses in their iconic red paint rumble past, their engines vibrating in the chest of anyone standing too close. The sidewalk is a river of people, thousands of lives intersecting for a fraction of a second before diverging again. Andrew turns slightly to his right, heading toward the bus stops or perhaps the underground entrance. And then he is gone. The camera at the exit captures the back of his head, the dark hair, the strap of the bag, and then the frame empties. He has walked out of the frame and into a silence that has now lasted for over 17 years. The sun continues to shine on the London streets, and the thousands of other cameras scattered across the city continue to spin their digital thread. But for Andrew, the thread is cut. What follows is perhaps the most painful chapter of the investigation, a series of missed opportunities that feel like sand slipping through desperate fingers. When Andrew did not return home that evening, the alarm was raised, but the initial response was hindered by a tragic administrative error. The school had tried to call his parents to report his absence, but they had dialed a wrong number, leaving a message on a stranger's machine. It was not until 7 o'clock that night that his family realized he was not just late, but missing. Within 2 days, the South Yorkshire police reached out to the British Transport Police, asking them to scour the footage from King's Cross. But the reply was disheartening. The transit officers claimed the crowds were too dense and the resolution too poor to identify a single 14-year-old boy. The search for the digital trail stalled. For nearly 3 weeks, the investigation remained centered in Doncaster, while the critical evidence sat in a storage drive in London, ticking toward its expiration. It was only after South Yorkshire officers traveled to the capital themselves and sat through hours of grainy, flickering playback that they finally spotted him. By then, the damage was done. In a city like London, CCTV is often overwritten every 31 days, or even sooner on private systems. Because of the delay, the footage from the surrounding buses, the shops on Euston Road, and the nearby intersections had vanished, erased to make room for the mundane movements of the days that followed. Imagine the frustration, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of the stomach. London is one of the most surveilled cities in the world, a place where a person is caught on camera hundreds of times a day. Had the net been cast immediately, the path Andrew took after 11:25 might have been mapped out block by block. We might have seen if he boarded a bus toward the museums he loved, or if he walked toward the record shops of Soho, or if someone was waiting for him in the shadow of a doorway. Instead, the investigation was met with a wall of white noise. The 3-week delay meant that the vital window of time had slammed shut. The trail was not just cold, it had been wiped clean. As the family distributed flyers across London, showing the image of the boy in the black shirt, they were fighting against a ghost. The grainy still from the King's Cross exit became the icon of the case. A young boy stepping into the light, his whole life ahead of him, and the city of 8 million people closing in around him like a heavy, velvet curtain. Every lead that followed, every unconfirmed sighting in Covent Garden or on Oxford Street, would be haunted by the knowledge that the proof had once existed, recorded on a magnetic tape or a hard drive, only to be lost to the slow, uncaring grind of bureaucracy and time. The morning of September 14th, 2007, began with a quiet, calculated deception that only a mind as organized as Andrew's could execute. In the stillness of the family home in Doncaster, after his parents had departed for their workday, Andrew moved through the rooms like a ghost in his own life. He did something that still haunts the memory of those who loved him, a small act of domesticity that feels heavy with hidden meaning. He took off his school uniform, the crisp shirt, and the trousers he was expected to be wearing in a classroom miles away, and he placed them carefully into the washing machine. Perhaps he wanted to hide the evidence of his change into casual clothes, or perhaps, in his meticulous way, he simply couldn't bear to leave a mess behind. On the back of a wooden chair in his bedroom, he left his school blazer, its dark fabric hanging limp and empty, a discarded shell of the boy the world thought he was. Inside the drawers of his desk, other things remained, tucked away in the velvet silence of the house. There was approximately £100 in cash, saved from birthdays and holidays, that lay untouched. To a 14-year-old boy, £100 is a significant fortune, a safety net that could have bought many nights of shelter. And yet, it stayed there, resting in the shadows of a room that was rapidly becoming a museum of his absence, the air thick with the scent of laundry detergent and the ticking of a clock he no longer needed to follow. When he finally stepped across the threshold and into the cool morning air, he carried a black canvas satchel slung across his shoulder. It was a messenger-style bag, the kind favored by teenagers of the era, but for Andrew, it was a canvas of his identity. The rough, dark fabric was adorned with patches, those small, embroidered signals of belonging that speak volumes in the silent language of youth. These patches displayed the names of his favorite bands, the aggressive, masked imagery of Slipknot, and the atmospheric reach of Muse. Inside that bag, he placed a few specific items with the same quiet intent that defined his morning. There was his wallet, now weighted with £200 in crisp banknotes he had just withdrawn from an automated teller machine near the park. He had emptied his account almost entirely, leaving only a few pounds behind that the machine refused to dispense. He also carried his house keys, a small cluster of metal that chimed softly against each other as he walked, a sound that usually implies a plan to return, a way to let oneself back into the sanctuary of home. Along with these, he brought his PlayStation Portable, a sleek black handheld gaming device. Later, witnesses on the train would recall seeing a boy who looked like Andrew, his head bowed, his thumbs moving rhythmically over the controls, the tiny screen casting a pale blue glow against his glasses as the English countryside blurred into a smear of green and gray outside the window. But there was a glaring omission in his packing, a detail that has become one of the most agonizing puzzles of the entire case. Andrew did not take the charger for his PlayStation Portable. To anyone who has ever felt the pull of a digital world, the charger is the lifeline, the umbilical cord that keeps the device from becoming a useless slab of plastic and glass. Without it, the bright screen would eventually flicker and dim, the battery drained of its energy within a few hours of play. By the time he reached the iron-wrought heart of King's Cross Station, the device might already have been nearing its end, a red light blinking like a warning heartbeat. If he had planned a long-term disappearance, or even just a stay of more than a day, the charger would have been an essential, effortless inclusion. It was small, light, and sat right there in his room. Its absence suggests a terrifying range of possibilities that investigators have weighed for nearly 2 decades. Did he only intend to be gone for a few hours, believing he would be back in his own bed, plugging the device into the wall before the moon set? Or was his mind so intensely focused on a singular, overwhelming destination that the practical needs of the following day simply ceased to exist in his calculations? It is a silence in his satchel that speaks louder than any word he could have written, a void where a simple black cord should have been. To understand these choices, we must look at the mind that was making them, a mind that was, by all accounts, extraordinary. Andrew was a gifted mathematician, a young man who looked at the world and saw patterns, logic, and the elegant inevitability of a proven theorem. He had recently returned from an elite summer camp for the most talented children in the country, a program reserved for the top 5% of students, those already being scouted for the hallowed mathematics departments of Cambridge or Oxford. To a mathematician, there is a reason for every variable, a deliberate step for every movement in a proof. His decision to travel to London was likely not a chaotic impulse, but a calculated journey toward a specific coordinate. At the station in Doncaster, when the ticket seller informed him that a return ticket would cost only 50 pence more than the single he requested, Andrew stood his ground. He insisted on the one-way fare. To a logical mind, 50 pence is a negligible sum to pay for the security of a way home, even if that way home is an uncertain backup plan. His refusal was an act of precision. He wasn't just wandering toward the capital. He was moving with the unwavering certainty of a line drawn on a graph, heading toward a point in his own internal geometry that only he could see, leaving the safety of his birthday money and his academic future behind in the dust of the north. As he emerged from the station into the sprawling, chaotic energy of London, he was a study in shadows and contrast. He wore black jeans, black trainers, and a black Slipknot t-shirt with a bold, aggressive design on the chest. This shirt was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a uniform of the counterculture he felt a part of, a talisman of the music that resonated in the quiet spaces of his thoughts. In the churning sea of commuters in their gray suits and muted tones, he should have been easy to spot, a dark silhouette against the pale stone of the city. He wore a watch on his left wrist, its hands marking the passage of seconds into minutes as he stepped onto the pavement. The air in London that morning was mild, the late summer sun casting long, sharp shadows through the Victorian architecture. He had no coat, no extra layers for the cooling evening air that would eventually settle over the Thames. He walked with the steady, quiet purpose of someone who had already finished his deliberations. With his black bag slung across his body and the patches of his favorite bands catching the filtered city light, he was a boy defined by his passions, mathematics, metal music, and a fierce, private autonomy. He walked forward, leaving the iron tracks of the railway behind, and stepped into the vast, indifferent pulse of a city that was about to fold him into its deepest shadows. The city of London does not merely house people, it absorbs them. As he stepped out from the arched Victorian shadow of King's Cross, the air was a thick soup of diesel fumes, roasted coffee, and the metallic tang of the underground. The sunlight of that Friday morning, September 14th, 2007, was sharp and unforgiving, casting long, geometric shadows across the pavement. In the grainy footage, he is a small figure, almost fragile against the backdrop of the Capitol's relentless pace. He walked away from the eyes of the station and into a maze of 8 million souls, carrying a canvas bag and the 200 pounds he had pulled from an automated teller machine earlier that morning. For a few hours, the world seemed to ripple with his presence. There was a sighting at a Pizza Hut on Oxford Street, a place of clattering plates and the heavy, sweet scent of baked dough and melted cheese. A witness saw a boy who looked just like him, sitting in the corner, perhaps watching the tide of humanity flow past the window. His parents believe this was him. They can see him there in their minds. A quiet boy in a loud room, his black band t-shirt a dark blot against the bright, commercial red of the restaurant. But like a reflection in a window when the light shifts, the image vanished. There were whispers of him in Covent Garden, stories of a boy sleeping in a park in Southwark as the nights turned cold. But London is a city of echoes, and by the time the authorities turned their gaze toward the security tapes, more than a month had already bled away. The tapes had been recorded over. The digital memories of 1,000 cameras had wiped themselves clean, leaving only the silence of the streets and the agonizing questions that would haunt his family for decades. Back in the quiet suburb of Balby, the silence in the Gosden house became a physical weight, something heavy and cold that sat in the corners of every room. The initial days of frantic calls and pacing the floor transitioned into a different kind of labor, the labor of visibility. Kevin and Wendy took to the streets, not just in their hometown, but across the entire breadth of the United Kingdom. Imagine the texture of those early weeks. The sound of packing tape being ripped from a plastic roll, a harsh, jagged noise that cut through the quiet of the night. The feel of glossy paper, cold and slick against the fingertips, bearing the face of a boy with a slight, knowing smile and strong, dark-rimmed glasses. These posters became a permanent fixture of the British landscape. They were taped to the salt-crusted railings of pier sides in Whitby and pasted onto the soot-stained brickwork of London's back alleys. Over time, the sun would bleach the ink until the black of his shirt turned to a ghostly gray, and the rain would cause the edges to curl and peel like dead skin. But as soon as one faded, another would take its place. The family worked tirelessly with the charity known as Missing People, a name that became an anchor in a storm that refused to break. They turned their private grief into a public campaign, a relentless, heartbreaking effort to ensure that the face of the 14-year-old boy remained etched into the collective mind, even as the world around them moved on, oblivious and hurried. Inside their home in Doncaster, time behaved strangely. It was a house where one person was missing, but their presence was louder than those who remained. Andrew's bedroom became a cathedral of memory. For many years, it was left exactly as it had been on that Friday morning. The bed remained unmade, the smell of old paper and the faint, sweet scent of a teenager's life still clinging to the fabric of the curtains. There were the shelves that Kevin and Andrew had built together when the boy was only 10 years old. Kevin could still feel the phantom vibration of the chisel in his hand as they cut the slots for the glass, a shared project of wood and quiet pride. Eventually, the room had to be touched. The walls were repainted. They chose a deep blue, the specific, vibrant shade that Andrew had picked out years before he vanished. It was a way of moving forward without leaving him behind, a compromise with a reality that offered no closure. Outside in the garden, the oak trees that Andrew had planted from acorns when he was a child continued to grow. Their roots pushed deep into the South Yorkshire soil, their branches reaching higher with every passing season. Kevin would watch them, a living, breathing timeline of the years his son should have had. He spoke of his life as being split into two layers, like oil and water that refused to mix. On the surface, he functioned. He went to work, he spoke to neighbors, he breathed. But beneath that surface, he was stuck, paralyzed in the amber of 2007, forever waiting for the heavy click of a key in the front door. The psychological toll of the search was a slow, agonizing erosion of the spirit. Kevin described the ambiguous loss as a sensation like being stabbed in the stomach. A normal wound would be stitched, it would scar, and eventually the pain would dull. But this was an open wound that was twisted every time the telephone rang or a new lead flickered into existence. In November 2008, more than a year after the disappearance, a man walked up to the intercom at the Leominster police station in the middle of the night. He spoke into the cold metal grill, claiming he had information about Andrew. But by the time an officer could get to the door, the man was gone, dissolved back into the darkness. Later, an anonymous letter arrived at the BBC, suggesting Andrew had been seen in the town of Shrewsbury. Each of these moments was a cruel tether, pulling the family back toward hope only to drop them into a deeper despair. Kevin found himself carrying a needle in his pocket. It was a grim tool of grounding. When the nightmare of the reality became too much to bear, he would prick his skin to see if he was truly awake or if he was finally trapped in a fever dream. The pressure of the investigation and the sheer, exhausting weight of the silence led to a moment where he nearly took his own life. He felt that he needed to get out of the way so the authorities could focus on Andrew. It was a testament to the fact that when a child goes missing, the parents are often lost as well, wandering a landscape where the landmarks have all been erased. As the years stretched into a decade, and then more, the search evolved into a study of what might have been. The family had to face the passage of time in a way no parent should ever have to. They worked with forensic artists to create age progression images. It is a haunting process, watching a computer algorithm add weight to a jawline and lines to the corners of eyes that you haven't seen in the flesh for thousands of days. They released a version of him at 25, and then older, imagining him without his glasses, perhaps wearing contact lenses, perhaps with his hair grown long or cut short. They told the public to look for his specific features, the unusual double ridge on his right ear, a detail as unique as a fingerprint. Kevin feared that he might walk past his own son on a busy London street and not recognize the man he had become. Andrew would be 32 years old now. His sister, Charlotte, has grown up, found love, and started a family of her own. She has a son now, a little boy named Marco, who will grow up hearing stories of an uncle who is a shadow. The family remains in the same house, with the same phone number and the same locks on the doors. They have never changed them, because Andrew took his key with him that morning. They hold on to the belief that if he is out there, if he is simply living a life they cannot see, he must know that the door is always unlocked, that the blue room is waiting, and that the silence of the last 18 years has never once been a sign that he was forgotten. The years had settled over the story of Andrew Gosden like a fine, persistent dust. Since that Friday in September 2007, the world had changed in ways a 14-year-old boy from Doncaster could never have imagined. The brickwork of King's Cross had been cleaned and polished, the old, clicking departure boards replaced by silent digital screens, and the echoes of his footsteps had long since been buried under the frantic pace of millions of other travelers. For over 14 years, the silence from the capital was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet that filled the rooms of the Gosden family home in South Yorkshire. But then, in the cold, biting air of December 2021, the stillness was suddenly, violently shattered. A ripple of movement came from the south, carrying with it a hope that was as terrifying as it was welcome. The investigation, which many had come to view as a tragic, frozen monument to a lost boy, suddenly lurched into life. On a Tuesday in early January 2022, the public learned of a dramatic development that had occurred just weeks prior. On the 8th of December, as London prepared for the holiday season with twinkling lights and the smell of roasted chestnuts in the damp air, police had made a move. 2 men, one aged 45 and the other 38, were arrested at addresses in London. The charges were heavy, carrying the weight of nightmares: kidnap and human trafficking. For the first time in nearly 15 years, the police were using words that implied Andrew might not have simply vanished into the ether, but had been held by hands that meant him harm. Along with the arrests, numerous electronic devices were seized: laptops, phones, and hard drives, to be subjected to the meticulous, slow-moving scrutiny of digital forensics. It was a moment of breathless intensity. For the Gosden family, it was a period they described as an intensified emotional journey, a sudden ascent into a storm after years of walking through a fog. Imagine the passage of those following months. The seasons turned from the frost of winter to the tentative blooms of spring, and still, the silence returned, though this time it was a silence of anticipation. Behind the closed doors of forensic laboratories, technicians combed through terabytes of data, searching for a face, a name, or a trace of a boy who would now be a man in his late 20s. The police had warned that the process could take 6 to 12 months, but the clock seemed to tick with an agonizing slowness. For the family, this was a new kind of limbo. It was the possibility of an answer, however dark that answer might be. They lived in the shadow of those seized devices, wondering if a single file or a forgotten message would finally reveal why Andrew had stepped off that train, and where he had gone when the CCTV cameras stopped watching. The mystery of the boy in the black t-shirt was no longer just a memory. It was a live, pulsing question again. Then came September 2023. The air was beginning to carry the same autumnal chill that had been present on the day Andrew disappeared 16 years earlier. The update from South Yorkshire Police was brief and final. The 2 men who had been arrested were eliminated from the inquiry. After nearly 2 years of investigation, the police were confident that they played no part in Andrew's disappearance. The digital trails had led to dead ends. The suspicions had not crystallized into evidence. In a show of extraordinary grace, Andrew's parents, Kevin and Glennie's, released a statement expressing their sympathy for the men who had been exonerated, acknowledging the distress that such a public investigation must have caused them. But beneath the grace was the crushing weight of a return to the start. The door that had creaked open was now firmly shut. The lead that promised everything had delivered nothing, leaving the case as cold as the stone of the station platform. Today, the story of Andrew Gosden resides in the quiet spaces. It lives in the empty chair, a term used by his father to describe the permanent vacancy at their dinner table. In their home in Doncaster, Andrew's room remains a time capsule of 2007. The posters of rock bands still cling to the walls, their colors perhaps a little faded by the afternoon sun. The objects he touched, the books he read, and the bed where he slept that final night are all still there, waiting. It is a room held in a state of perpetual readiness, a testament to a love that refuses to let the light go out. Every year, on the 10th of July, the family marks his birthday, and every September 14th, they mark the anniversary of his departure. They continue to campaign, to work with charities for missing people, and to keep his face in the public eye. They do not seek vengeance. They seek only the truth, a way to bridge the gap between the boy who left and the man he might have become. We are left with the image of a young man walking out of King's Cross into the bright morning light of a city that never stops moving. The world has moved on, but for some, time is a circle that always returns to that single, inexplicable moment of vanishing. As we leave the shadows of this mystery, we carry with us the reminder of how fragile our connections can be, and the enduring strength of those who stay behind to keep the watch. There are no more chapters to read tonight, no more clues to unearth in the dark. The streetlights of London and the quiet lanes of Doncaster are still, and the questions belong to the silence now. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.